All right, hello again, everyone. Today we're going to be continuing our section on deontology. We're going to talk about the ethics of lying. So, Solomon's piece here, "Is it ever right to tell a lie?" is super interesting and super fun, and also like super short. So I know you guys appreciate it. But if you haven't read it, go back and read it. It is a lot of fun. Um, so is it ever okay to tell a lie? Or is it, I should say, is it ever morally right to tell a lie? Solomon answers no, right? Uh, there, uh, uh, there are instances, he nuances his answer, right? So there are instances where it's justified or it makes sense to tell a lie, but it's never like morally right. And I think by morally right, he means morally obligated. So his target here is lying in the context of advertising. So for instance, if I'm say I'm selling toothpaste, um, I'm going to claim that my toothpaste works better than the other brands of toothpaste because it will help convince you to buy my toothpaste. However, it may not actually be true, right? Or I may be, say, bending the truth a little bit. And so he talks about how in advertising, there are a number of different kinds of deception, or maybe withholding some of the truth, or bending the truth, or exaggerating that occur, right? And these can be okay. Um, so Solomon wants to say that some lies are a whole lot worse than others. So for instance, if I were to lie to you about the effects of a dangerous drug, that would be a lot worse than, say, lying about the efficiency of the food processor that I'm trying to sell you, right? Um, so when the stakes are higher, right? When more rides on being or holding true beliefs, lying is much worse in those cases. But Solomon also says that just like an unrequited commitment to telling people the truth is like kind of stupid, right? So he says that truth may always be desirable, but the whole truth and nothing but the truth is just as likely to be a nightmare, right? So if we were completely and brutally honest with one another all of the time, like we would hurt each other's feelings, right? Like, no, I hate your soup, it sucks, right? um, and I would maybe hurt my friend's feelings who made the soup for me. And also in the advertising world, we can assume that just being super honest about every single detail will likely end up with somebody not getting their point across and not being able to convince anybody to buy their product. Now, maybe that's not such a bad thing. We might disagree with Solomon, like, no, it doesn't matter if advertisers can't sell to us. Um, but at least according to Solomon, he thinks that we shouldn't just have this like super commitment to the truth where we share the whole truth all of the time. Okay, so is lying ever justified? We've kind of talked about this a little bit already. So Solomon wants to say that even though lying is always wrong, it's sometimes the best thing to do. There are sometimes reasons to lie, so long as lying is like a last resort option, right? So if we've exhausted all of other sort of um, potential actions, right, or all other options, we can then lie, right? So he also wants to say that one reason to think that lying can be justified is that sometimes telling the truth has much worse outcomes than lying. So, for instance, lying can have better outcomes in advertising, like we've been talking about, in the workplace, in relationships, and in other situations and places as well. So, for instance, lying has a really good outcome in the murderer at the door example, which we talked about with the Steinhoff piece, right? So Steinhoff has some objections to deontology, and we looked at not his own objection, but an objection to deontology, which says that if there's a murderer at the door and they say, um, if they say something like, uh, if your friend is at home, I'm going to kill him. You can say, yes, he's at home, or you can say no. So it seems like the better thing to do is to say, no, my friend is not at home. And the murderer would presumably just like walk away, right? So it's better to lie to the murderer. We get a better outcome to lie to the murderer. Now, I think that Solomon wants to say is that it's still wrong to lie in that instance. However, if lying will get us the best outcome, that's a justification for lying, but it's still wrong, right? But it's not as wrong as, say, other instances of lying. Okay. So, like, why think that lying is always wrong, right? I was reading this piece. I was like, he does not seem to think that lying is always wrong. So here's one thing. Lying, according to Solomon, maybe always, I'm not 100% sure, but anyway, sometimes or always involves an enormously complex network of facts, false facts, which are hard to keep up with. And he asserts that the costs of which are greater than just telling the truth. So, like, you have probably told a lie before. And like when you tell somebody a lie, you have to like also change other features of the story, right? Suppose you caught a fish that was like this big, right? But you really caught one that was like this big, something like that. And you were like, oh yeah, it was really easy to pull out and to like reel in and get out of the water. You might be like, oh, but didn't you say your fish was like this big? So what, didn't it put up a fight? And you're like, oh yeah, it did put up a fight. I forgot, you know? And so you have to keep lying about other things, and you have to kind of keep changing up your story um, based on the lies that you tell. And so Solomon wants to say that keeping up with the story is like part of the problem, right? And it's always easier to just tell the truth and come clean than to keep up with this like gigantic web of stories, right? I mean, in response to this, I don't think that lying always involves like an enormous complex network of facts, right? It might just be like, I could just say to you, I've been to Bakersfield, California before. The end, right? And it seems like you might be like, oh, okay, you've been to Bakersfield, California. Now that was a lie, but it feels like there are instances where we can just isolate some false claim and tell it to another person without having to weave in all these details, right? So I'm not 100% sure about this first reason. Okay, secondly, lying diminishes trust. So it diminishes trust in two ways. Let's start with the second one first. If you get caught lying, people aren't going to trust you. This is sort of a general sort of fact, right? I think that that's very plausible. But secondly, and I think more interestingly, is that when you are a habitual liar, this breeds an attitude of skepticism about other people, right? Because you're thinking to yourself, you're lying to people, and then you're like hearing people respond to you, and you're like, well, I'm lying all the time. Why is it not the case that these other people aren't also lying to me all the time too? And so you can foster kind of this problematic attitude where you lack trust in other people, right? Um, Maybe some level of skepticism is kind of healthy, but there's also some kind of unhealthy skepticism. And I think that Solomon wants to say that habitually lying leads to this kind of unhealthy skepticism of other people. So, and that's interesting. And then the third reason is basically the universalization formula from Kant. I was expecting this when I started reading it, and lo and behold, it was there. So the idea here is that if everybody was a liar, we like promise making wouldn't make any sense, right? Telling the truth actually wouldn't make any sense. We could never sort of function together or believe anybody else if everybody adopted that as a maxim. But the thing is when we tell somebody something, we're presuming that they're going to believe what we say, right? There's kind of this underlying trust between all human relationships. And so if everybody were to lie, that kind of inherent trust is like goes away. And so the very purpose of telling people things, right, which is to convey true things, the very purpose of telling people stuff goes away because everybody's just bent on lying, right? I think this is just really interesting. So Solomon wants to say that lying is always wrong for these reasons. However, there can be better and worse instances of lying. And sometimes it is okay to lie, prudentially speaking, but also say, just like pragmatically speaking, it's okay to lie sometimes, even though it's morally wrong technically. Okay, so this was an interesting paper. Thank you for listening to my presentation.